Thank you for joining us. This is a presentation that was given to the Planning Commission on June 8th that provides an overview of the technical report and analysis that was released at that time. You can find that technical report on this website where you found this presentation. We invite you to review that and provide any comments regarding the approaches that are outlined within the report. So let's get started. Why are we updating the Hot Springs zoning code? Well, there's a number of reasons for this. Probably the one with the most priority is to implement Forward Hot Springs, which is the city's comprehensive plan. Taking those land use policies and really making sure that they can translate where applicable into development regulations is really one of the key ways that comprehensive plans are implemented. Also, we want to organize this document to be more user-friendly and to be more predictable so that I can understand what can happen on my property and I can understand what happens on the property next to me, and it's consistently applied. We want to integrate some land use and design into objective standards to ensure we get the high-quality development that needs to happen within Hot Springs. We want to enhance and protect the neighborhood character. We want to look at requiring fewer special approvals for things that are logical, that should be happening. They shouldn't have to go through hoops like variances in order for that to happen. And we also want to increase the transparency of development approvals so that whether I am applying for something like a conditional use, I know exactly what happens, or if I'm interested in somebody else that is looking to put in a conditional use, I know from the ordinance how that process will go. One of the things that's important to note is short-term rental regulations are not going to be addressed as part of this update. We know this is something that has a lot of issues and concerns within Hot Springs, but this is not part of this process. Those standards will remain part of Chapter 10. So one of the first things we want to do is, as I said, make things user-friendly. So it's important to implement a number of organizational principles that really will help facilitate that. The first is compartmentalization, where we group like with like, and it becomes a logical progression of what's in the ordinance. To do a graphic orientation to the code, really to help illustrate the different regulations and standards that we have in place. We want to make sure all the different terms are defined, and there's one definition for each of those terms, so it's very clear how to interpret the code. Make sure the same way measurement methodologies, that we're consistent in how things like building height or lot width are measured. And again, illustrating those so it's very clear how those are applied. And then finally, to contain a consistent voice, that we're using the same terms throughout the ordinance to mean the same thing. Things are written in a voice that is the same from beginning to end, making it easier to follow along what the regulations are. The first principle that we just mentioned was compartmentalization, and this is really a way to organize the ordinance so that all the different things that are related to each other are kind of found in the same spot, so it becomes easy to identify where I would be looking for those. We begin with kind of the introductory components. These are things like the title and the purpose of the code, the general definitions and the measurement methodologies, as I talked about, and then the zoning districts and the zoning map, an introduction to those. We then move to really the heart of the ordinance, the various districts that make up the city of Hot Springs, and organizing them by larger land use category, so residential, commercial, industrial, and then certain special purpose districts. And then related to that, the next would be the uses, basically which uses are allowed in which districts, whether they're permitted or conditional. Kind of moving away from the principal use and the principal structure, we would move to the site development standards. So this would include things like general development standards, things like a site triangle or fence requirements, the accessory structures, addressing all the parking issues. We've proposed to move landscape, which is in Chapter 9 of Title 16, into the code. Similarly, signs, which is Chapter 5 of Title 16, to move that into the code so that all of these different things are working together with the various standards we've established in the districts. We also look at administration, who administers this code, and then Article 15, how do I submit and what happens to my application, and then finally the specific standards that apply to each of the different applications and approvals. And then finally, application, what happens to those uses or structures that remain non-conforming, and then how is the ordinance enforced. So one of the bigger first changes we're proposing is a revision to the use approach. This is really looking at creating a use matrix where uses are tailored to the purpose of each of these districts, so that nothing relies on the other districts in terms of what's allowed. You can easily see how that would work. We want to move towards a more modern generic use approach. As you can see here in the illustration, shoe store, clothing store, record store, hardware store are no longer called out individually. They're kind of part of this larger category called retail goods. One of the key things regarding the generic use approach is that there are still uses that are of concern. Kind of a common one is usually adult uses, but really this could be anything from, we've seen things pulled out like a, tattoo parlor, massage parlor, where we want to make sure that we're either restricting the districts they're allowed in, we're either making them conditional, we're putting additional standards on those, and that's something that gets refined in each draft. We want to make sure that we are addressing any uses that are of concern to the residents or that have impacts that we really want to mitigate, which is, as you see in the next point, requiring use standards for some of these to control the impacts. And this use matrix, which I'll show an example of, would contain principal, temporary, and accessory uses within it so that it's very clear what's allowed within each district. So as you can see here, it's an example of a use matrix. This is an example. This is not Hot Springs. This is a different community. But you can see how this is organized, where I just basically look down and I can see that if there is a C, it is a conditional use. If it's P, it is permitted by right. And if it's blank, it's not allowed within that district. What this really does is allow for two ways into the use structure of the code. Either I own a piece of property in a certain district and I can look down the column and I can see where something is conditional, where something is permitted, and what uses aren't allowed. Or if, say, I would like to establish a use, let's say a cultural facility, I can look across the table and see which districts would allow my use and where it is permitted or conditional. And so we need to address, as we're doing this and modernizing the use approach, we're bringing in some additional uses that really speak to a number of the policies within Forward Hot Springs. One of the first is the corner store. We call it here in zoning language the neighborhood commercial establishment. And these are stores that have been in place. It's kind of the local grocer that you may consider on the corner. Really allowing those to reopen with a number of standards around them so that they maintain a kind of very low impact presence within the neighborhood. The intent here is to establish standards because these are in residential areas that basically allow them to function and serve the residential area. We want to make sure that we're encouraging maker-creator spaces. These are uses like artisan industrial, specialty food service, which would be an example, would be a coffee roaster, a commercial kitchen, which allows for various people to come in and kind of start their restaurant or their food service businesses. And we know one of the big things here in Hot Springs is addressing food truck parks and kind of where we put food trucks, how we control those. As is the case in many other communities as well, we work across the country. We do have to address a whole series of social service uses. This is everything from care homes to residential care facilities, children's homes, shelters and food pantries, and really providing places for them in the appropriate districts with the appropriate standards tied to them as well. We want to address a full range of temporary uses, and again, these temporary uses are those that occur on private property. So these are not things that happen in the right-of-way. So it's everything from, temporary outdoor events such as sales or entertainment. Think of a Christmas tree lot, pumpkin patch, carnival on a church parking lot, mobile food trucks that locate within a parking lot. So again, all of these the controls would be for those on private property. We also, as I said, address accessory uses. So this is everything from drive-throughs to home occupations to accessory dwelling units. And we know that ADUs are new, and so these will need specific standards around them in order to make sure that they are not obtrusive to the surrounding neighborhood. Oftentimes, these standards are things like lots must be a certain size, a limitation of one per lot, a maximum height, a maximum size, basically limiting it so the footprint is smaller than the home that it shares the lot with, and some design standards. So really we are starting to work through these, and again, this will be brought forth in the draft. So the first set of districts would be the residential districts, and we want to do a number of updates on the controls within them. We look at revising the front setback controls. Many of the lots, based on our sampling, do not meet the current standards for the residential district, so we want to allow for things like front setback averaging, which would meet the character of the district. We want to create a specific corner lot setback, because we know there's been some issues in the application of that, and really making sure that that standard allows the lot to remain buildable. We need to clarify the setbacks in the lake area. This is important because, it's not really a front yard and a rear yard when you're on water. There's kind of a street yard and a waterfront yard, and so we want to make sure that those are very clear in how they're applied. Create new building heights so that there's a set number for these residential districts. Eliminating the FAR controls. We have found that these are really not effective in controlling the bulk of smaller structures such as residential. FAR was created for the use of skyscrapers. We think with building coverage, impervious surface coverage, building height, the setbacks that are required, we can really control the volume of structures that way. And allow for new forms of residential development, which would be something along the lines of a cottage court development. And here is an example. This is a drawing from another community, so we haven't worked things out specifically for Hot Springs at this point, but really a cottage court is a series of smaller lots, single family, that is organized around a courtyard. It's meant to provide kind of another way of providing more affordable housing. The houses are smaller, the lots are smaller, but the standards work to really organize it so that it can fit into a neighborhood and that it is compatible with what's going on around it, and it's got a cohesive layout. So it's not just scattered smaller lots, it's organized around this central feature. So in looking at the districts, we've kind of taken a look at the current districts and made some proposals regarding a new district structure. So you can see here your first district is the RR Rural Residential. This relates to the R1, really looking at a 1 acre lot size here. We also saw in kind of looking at the different lot sizes that perhaps it's important to have an estate residential district, the RE. This would be a new district that is, these are the ones that don't meet the standards of the RR, the 1 acre, but they're larger than what is the current R2, so essentially proposed to be a 20,000 square foot lot size. The RN1, the residential neighborhood 1, relates to the current R2 suburban. It's really intended to maintain that character based upon what we looked at there. Reducing the lot size to 10,000 square feet would make more lots conforming. So that's really what that one would be addressing. The RN2, the residential neighborhood 2, as proposed, relates to the R3. This would be a single family district of 7,000 square feet. Essentially, we're just recommending to eliminate the distinction for a 7,500 square foot lot for a corner lot. We'll address that, as I said, through the new corner side setback regulations. The RN3 would be a new district. These are areas of small lot single family that are proposed. We are continuing to do analysis to determine the final lot size that would be present there, but really we've heard from many people that there is a need for a small lot single family development. The RN4 would be a transitional district. It would be new. It transitions from purely single family to higher density. It looks at addressing that missing density, as you know, affordability, different types of housing availability are key parts of the Forward Hot Springs plan, and this would help to bring that to fruition. The RN5 would relate to the current R4 medium high density. This would allow for a variety of dwelling types, so everything from single family to multifamily, again with standards placed around the size and scale of those and how they would develop. The RN6 would be a new district. This is for denser development types, so this would be for townhouse and multifamily dwellings, kind of looking at where those would be appropriate. And then continuing over the RL Lakes area district. Important here to distinguish what happens in the lake area between the waterfront lots and those that don't have water frontage. So it's really a refinement of those standards. In terms of the commercial districts, we really are looking to update the controls that are within there. In some cases, as we look at areas, say like the downtown, we want to incorporate things like build-to zones so that we can continue the character. We understand many of the commercial areas are on state roads, so things like a build-to zone would not be appropriate. So we've got that in mind as we start to craft these standards. Again, establishing building heights. What we're thinking here is also there may be some contextual height controls for areas like the Central Business District, just because of the topography and the features that are there. So we want to make sure that we preserve those view sheds and those view corridors that are in place there as well. Again, eliminating the FAR controls, again, created for skyscraper type development. We think through the different standards and the design that we may integrate that we can control what FAR was trying to control in a much more effective way. And then including design standards. Malvern Avenue, and from people we've talked to have said Malvern looks great. We want to take that approach and integrate it into all of the different commercial districts. So it's no longer done by an overlay. We're taking those standards you've already got and applying them as appropriate to the different commercial districts in order to ensure that type of high quality development each time. So we've proposed a new district structure, which really looks to build kind of going from the lowest scale to the kind of highest scale that's available and integrating things that we've seen as land use policies in Forward Hot Springs. The first is the CTR, the commercial transitional. These are ways to transition from residential to commercial, making it small scale commercial. We have said here to loosen the current controls to let it function as a by right, as a true transition. This doesn't mean that it's kind of completely open. We'll still be looking, as we talked about before, in terms of uses. You'll still see some are conditional, which have a public process behind them. Others are permitted. That would be most appropriate there. So it's really kind of looking at creating the right standards and creating the right use structure. So that it's amenable both to the nearby residential as well as somebody looking to establish commercial. The CNC, the neighborhood commercial, we've kind of looked at this as part of the C3, the current C3 district. So we want to address nodal development that's in close proximity to residential areas, allowing for more non-residential uses, but making sure the standards maintain that compatibility. We also wanted to create a new commercial mixed-use district. This would be a higher intensity mixed use. We see now that it may be more limited in application at the start, but it provides a way to accommodate that mixed-use development. Really, it's a back pocket district in certain ways, because when areas become appropriate for this type of development, you've got something that makes that you can use that would be more predictable. This is more realistic than the current village district standard, which requires 40 acres, which is a significant amount of land. The CG, general commercial, this relates to the C2. Again, this is a variety of non-residential uses. It can look at accommodating any of the tourist areas that you've got as well. The CR, the regional, again, relates to the C4. This is the regional consumer base. This is along major commercial arterials and state roads. This is where people are coming for your IKEAs, those types of developments. And then finally, the CBD, the Central Business District, which relates to the C1. This is your most intense development, predominantly vertically mixed use environment. We want to make sure that we've got standards that keep it vibrant and active and pedestrian oriented. We want to achieve a very high quality of design. This is where you would see things, as I spoke about, the build to zones, and encourage building forms that really complement what's already there. So it's really just building on what's great already and making sure anything that's coming in is, taking from that and building upon that as well. The industrial districts, really these are pretty standard. The IL relates to the M1. We intend to really maintain the current standards. The I2 relates to the M2, maintain those current standards. And then we have proposed a new IMU, the mixed use industrial. This is a new district. These are industrial areas that may be in transition. You're starting to see a mix of light industrial and commercial. Usually what you see coming in there first is a doggy daycare, an indoor soccer thing, a Curves. So it really allows for those areas to get that mix of light industrial and commercial while protecting the other industrial areas from those types of encroachments. Also, we have found that this district really helps with adaptive reuse. You've got some good buildings in there. They may not be appropriate for industrial, but you can save those character-given buildings by allowing for commercial uses. Again, some updates within the industrial, establishing a building height, like we've talked about in the other districts, and eliminating FAR. In terms of special purpose and overlay districts, some of these are existing and some of these are new. There is the Ag District. Our proposal is to maintain that as it currently is. We do want to bring in a new institutional district. This is a new district with large institutional campuses. It could be healthcare, it could be education, could be municipal government, really to address those, because we really want to address the edges of those campuses with a little bit more flexibility for internally when things are happening inside there. The historic district would be a reference within the zoning code to make sure folks are aware that that is out there. The Malvern overlay, as I talked about in the commercial districts, this is really where we want to take the approach that was done for Malvern and integrate it into the various commercial districts so that we can see that elevated level of design that's already present along Malvern. So it's really an integration, not necessarily getting rid of Malvern, but using Malvern to build the other commercial districts. The seasonal parking overlay, the proposal here is to move it to the city code. It functions more as a permit. It's really more appropriate in the city code. And then finally, as we talked about earlier with the new commercial mixed use district, to eliminate the VD Village district, allowing it to be replaced by the new commercial structure. We also want to address a variety of development standards. So now we're kind of moving away from the principal uses and the principal structures to kind of all the different things that happen on a lot. There's some general applicability, things like site triangles, which are for public safety. What happens if you're doing development on well and septic, including performance standards for things like noise and dust and odor. Kind of really the things that kind of look at how a site performs. Include some exterior lighting controls. While these may not be going the full level of dark skies, it's incorporating the principles, so looking at things that can simply control light trespass, light pollution. We want to address a range of accessory structures. These are just some examples. It's kind of a more comprehensive list you'll see in the draft. So things like garages and carports, mechanical equipment, allowing for solar and wind, cold frames as you see there in the graphic that's located on this slide. Basically talking about how big they can be, where they can be, how tall they can be, where they can go on a lot. It's really just important to have those. We've also proposed a couple of environmental standards that we are considering for the draft. The first would be steep slope development, so that really ties to limits on disturbance. Currently, subdivision divides it as an 18% slope. So kind of building off of that, how can we protect these steep slope areas? And similarly, looking at waterfront buffers, creating waterfront buffer zones that we can protect the water from any kind of pollution that may get to it, preserve the bank that sits next to, really making sure that we're doing those environmental protections. And then finally, permitted obstructions. And this is really in this table, which is again an example and not related to Hot Springs at all at this point. It's from another community. Those different types of architectural features that help to give a house character, and how much they can encroach into a required setback. So if you look at something like eaves, allowing them to encroach, say, 18 inches into a required setback, really doesn't hamper the building envelope, but actually encourages the use of eaves because they can encroach into that setback. So it provides some architectural features, it provides some flexibility and leeway that really allow you to get some really kind of nice looking houses that you may not be able to get if everything would be forced inside a building envelope. We want to take a look at parking. We want to make sure that we're addressing a whole number of different things there. So really looking at the location of parking, how it works in relation to a structure, where it can be in relation to the street, how it's configured, some design elements for parking structures if those were to come up, looking at access standards, everything from driveways to stacking spaces for a drive-through to pick up and drop off space design, which is important these days as people move to kind of ride sharing or vehicle sharing, Ubers, Lyfts, and the like. Creating a full range of loading requirements and design for those types of uses that need loading. And then finally, commercial and recreational vehicle storage, just creating some very basic standards for those. We know recreational vehicles are a big thing in Hot Springs, so we're not looking to be very, very aggressive on how those are controlled, but we want to make some standards in place for kind of where they can be stored on a lot. We're also going to look at the parking ratios, which is the amount of parking required per each use. What becomes very convenient with the new use approach is we can tie those parking ratios directly back to that use table, so interpretation is minimized. We want to consider maybe in some areas, or maybe all areas, creating parking maximums so that you're not getting parking lots that are planning for the day before Christmas, and most of the year they're just empty. So this is a way to control the amount of paving that happens on a site. We know there's some realities here that we need to address in terms of parking flexibilities. So there may be certain districts that are exempt, such as the downtown. Adaptive reuse of buildings that have never had parking that are there, that we want to preserve, perhaps exempting those from parking. And then even considering exempting a certain amount of square footage from smaller businesses from the parking calculation, just trying to make things easier and not require them to be part of a variance application. We're looking at electric vehicles. One of the considerations proposed in the technical report is perhaps as part of larger parking facilities, whether it be a lot or a structure, that there be some requirements for electric vehicle parking to be installed as part of that, as part of new construction. In addition, there would be obviously allowances for anybody to kind of put in an electric vehicle charging space if they so wish. And then we're also looking at bicycle parking requirements. Being an active community, we want to make sure that, if people are biking to places, they've got a place to put their bike. And so that is one of the considerations that we have proposed. Related to parking, in particular parking lots, is landscape. And what we want to make sure is that we're getting some screening of landscape against the right-of-way. That we're getting some things that are working out in terms of the interior to kind of break up that heat island effect to allow for some stormwater absorption. So you can see here in these two examples, these are types of parking lot landscape that can be required. We also want to include buffer yards. Buffer yards help to screen and to mitigate impacts between incompatible uses. So if I'm residential up against an industrial, the industrial would install a buffer yard that's got fencing and trees and shrubs to kind of minimize the impacts that you're seeing from the industrial. And it's something that can be tweaked between the different types of uses, so that we're not creating a situation where people need variances. We've also proposed tree preservation, so, preserving trees over a certain size. We propose to work with the urban forester on this type of provision, but the urban canopy, and in particular, the natural character of hot springs, is important, and trees are a key component of that. We also want to encourage stormwater management in design, really making sure that you have the ability to incorporate that if you so wish. At this point, we haven't made it a requirement, but really when we work with communities, we often just encourage it, allow it, describe it, so that way people can think about it when they're designing their landscape areas. We do need to update signs. Again, this is like landscape. It's a different section of Title 16, but we propose to bring it into the code so that everything works together. One of the most important things is to create content neutral signs. These are based on decisions that have come from the Supreme Court. There's been two so far, Reed versus Gilbert and then Reagan versus Austin. And so it's very important that sign regulations do not speak to the content of the sign. And so we will go through the sign regulations as they are now, address the full range of sign types. So we anticipate some new ones will be added, make sure these all meet content neutrality standards, and really address all the different categories of permissions. So this includes permanent and temporary signs, types of signs that would be prohibited within hot springs, those that are exempt from requiring a permit, which are typically small things, say like a real estate sign, where there's real estate activity happening on a site, a small sign would be allowed with that, and then those that do require a permit. I think what's very important is that these sign types need to be tailored to the district form. So as we talked about kind of the different characters of the commercial or the different characters of the industrial and the sizes that may be there, that the signs work with those, that everything is complementing each other. We also wanted to include classic sign provisions. I believe we were told that that example that I pulled of the Tom Moore cigar sign is already protected. by the historic committee. But really looking at signs of that type, considering the age and the character of Hot Springs, there may be signs that are out there that are really character giving but don't match the standards that we have now. And so we can create a provision that would protect those into the future and allow them to be maintained and to be restored, really keeping those character giving signs and protecting them and allowing them to continue to contribute positively to the character of Hot Springs. At this time, just to be clear, we have not proposed any changes to the billboard regulations. So those won't be part of the sign update. Finally, kind of working through administration. Again, there's this idea of reorganizing, so you can see the code administrators, who's doing what, the general application procedures, kind of how would I proceed with submitting my application, what notice is required, really making that clear, and then finally the actual standards for applications and approvals. As part of this would be a completeness review, which is I submit my application and it would not move forward until it is verified by staff that everything I need is in there. This prevents incomplete applications from moving on to the Planning Commission or other bodies, and kind of making the process difficult for everybody. We also propose to move the application requirements to the packets. These are just the things that are required as part of your, say, conditional use or your variance. Those standards don't need to be in the code itself. They can be part of the application packet, therefore they can be waived or they can be supplemented. And if anything changes, a text amendment is not required. We've also proposed a minor modification procedure. This would be something approved administratively with very clear thresholds of what it can apply to. Here we've proposed, you can see in the report, 10% or less modification of dimensional standards, a parking reduction of 10% or less, certain aspects of the design standards. These would have to be related to, some sort of hardship or site condition, so it's not just a blanket permission to allow this to happen. Anything more than this would be a standard variance process. But really, this provides a kind of quicker way to address very small things that kind of keep coming up based on, in looking at some of the areas of Hot Springs, just the sites are not necessarily perfect grids. And so really this would help with that. Clarify how zoning interpretations operate, which is really just to interpret the provisions of the code. Say I want to open a certain type of store, I would go and get an interpretation that yes, my store fits under retail goods establishment. And then we wanted to simplify large-scale development, and this, as you can see in the bright red there, is in the subdivision regulations. And we are not updating the subdivision, but this one provision, because of its direct linkage to zoning, we want to make sure we address. Currently, it requires kind of Planning Commission approval for most of the things that it falls under. What we want to do is simplify this a little bit. If there is a large-scale development happening, the planning director can review it and approve it if all of the standards are met. So essentially, they meet all the zoning standards. If they are not meeting those, then it would move on to the Planning Commission. So it's a way to streamline this a little bit so that really the ones that meet everything that we're asking for in the code can kind of move forward a little bit more quickly. And then as we talked about temporary uses a while back, tied to those would be a temporary use permit that basically ensures that we're keeping an eye on these temporary uses that are out there. They're not becoming de facto permanent, and we have a way to control any of them that may become a nuisance by revoking the permit. We also want to modernize the plan development procedures. We propose an alternate approach. It's no longer would be applied as a district. It basically becomes a development approval. So essentially, the base district remains the same, but the PD approval goes on top of it. Modifications would still be allowed through the PD process as it is now. And then essentially, if no action is taken within a certain amount of time, that approval just expires and the base district controls come back into place. We find this is a way that really helps to control PDs and make sure that they're moving, that everybody who's invested time, whether it be staff, the applicant, or the neighbors who are concerned, really know that this is in furtherance of a real development. The approval would be a pre-application meeting with staff. We propose an optional concept plan review with the Planning Commission. This would be at the applicant's option, and then going through the development plan approval process. And PD has been kind of broadened. We have proposed not to target it towards infill development anymore, but really target it towards innovative things that need these additional flexibilities. And speaking of that, also proposed to add a public benefits requirement. Plan development is a negotiation. The applicant is asking for various modifications to what's allowed within the base district. And so in return for this, there should be negotiation with the city to look at what kind of benefits can come from that plan development. So it could be, examples include enhanced open space, creating a plaza or outdoor seating, including public art, incorporating some affordable housing in the development, and even sometimes just the PD itself. If it is an affordable housing development in its entirety, that could be the public benefit. So it wouldn't have to go and get, additional open space. We also think it's important that once PDs are approved, that there is a process in place to really look at what happens if things need to change. And again, we've proposed a 3-layer or 3-level kind of post-approval modifications. The first would be the zoning administrator, which would be very minor administrative changes. The planning commission would address another series of minor changes, and the board of directors would address major changes. Each of these would have very clear thresholds as to what's allowed within each category, with the zoning administrator being kind of the least flexible, just addressing small things that may happen on a site. And so you can see, if you look through the report, we've provided some examples of what those thresholds can be. But it's really meant to make things a little bit easier once that PD is in place and operating. And, you've got to move something a few feet. You've got to, there's something happening with the engineering of the site that needs modification. You shouldn't have to start all the way over from the beginning. Nonconformities, this is kind of our last section here. We want to make sure that we're addressing each of the different types of nonconformities that are present. Our goal, as we look at all the districts and all the uses and the standards, is to try to minimize nonconformities, to make things more conforming, to address the existing on-the-ground character. And so what's really important here is that there's still going to be some that just don't match the standards, and that's just the reality. But we want the rules for each of these to be clear, creating categories for each of these 5 different types, and making sure that everything is in place to allow these to continue within the reasonable bounds of the code. So a non-conforming use, this could be rules on how it can continue and then what happens if it's discontinued or abandoned. The non-conforming structure, looking at kind of how those are dealt with, residential versus non-residential, and perhaps some flexibilities for certain dimensional standards. If we incorporate new things like build-to zones, we may need some flexibilities for existing structures. Non-conforming site characteristic, which is things like landscape or exterior lighting or parking lot design, so that the whole structure doesn't become non-conforming, but that one characteristic is the one that is non-conforming and can be addressed separately. The non-conforming lot, allowing for building upon existing lots, and this applies to legal lots of record. And I believe similar standards are in place right now. And then finally, non-conforming signs, when those can be replaced following a certain percentage of damage. One of the last things we wanted to show was a potential new permission, kind of understanding the built residential environment of Hot Springs, in terms of kind of what happens with existing homes and how can we help to preserve those homes that are there that may just need a little bit of extra room. And so what we've proposed is for single family and 2-family, those that have, say, a wall that's encroaching into the interior side yard or into the rear yard, and they're too far in, they're violating what the setback standards are, but say somebody wants to put an addition on the top. What we want to do is allow this to happen, continuing that same plane of the wall, to go up for that, say, that second floor addition without having to set it back because it's, the first floor is encroaching into the required setback. We shouldn't have to push that second floor back. It looks funny, just quite frankly, and also it can be very expensive, and so therefore discourage people from continuing to invest in their homes. So there would be clear rules established around this, and we would be kind of allowing this to happen without a variation, but again, would be limited to single family and 2-family. So we thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Invite you to explore the website, www.codeforwardhs.com. There is an email there that you can provide any comments. We encourage you to read the technical review that we've done of the ordinance and the various approaches that provide more detail than even what we've provided today. And I know this has been a kind of a 40-minute long presentation, so we thank you for sticking with me. And again, so visit the website, see what's going on there. You'll see updates and different things happening on that website as we continue to move forward in this exciting process. And so again, thank you for listening, and let us know if you have any questions or comments.